Good morning, Michael.
Good afternoon, Sam. How are you? How are you today?
I am doing pretty well. How are you doing?
I'm very good. Have you played any games recently? I know you mentioned that you're a gamer on the podcast several times.
Yes.
What sort of games do you play, Sam?
All kinds. I love cozy games, like a good farming sim from time to time. I used to, back in the day, be into MMORPGs, but those are very time consuming.
You got all the right lingo. Anyway, Sam, when you're playing these games, do you feel like you're constantly having to adjust what you're doing to counter the threats or the villains or the enemy, or potentially even other players as their gaming style develops?
Sometimes, yes. I'd say generally, as you're ramping up into a game, yes.
I think I'm very much I will get very comfortable in that playing style, and then an enemy will do something completely different, and then it will completely throw me. I'm not a good strategist. But sadly, much as I'd love to discuss video games, we are going to be talking about real life and how everything is changing in the world of AI. Of course it is. Of course it is. I'm Michael Bird.
I'm Sam Jarrell, and welcome to Technology Now from HPE.
Now, Sam, as technology becomes more and more integrated into our lives, the number of cyber attacks has skyrocketed. Analysis published by Total Assure last year predicted around 803 million cyber attacks per day around the world, a staggering number, with approaching 300 million of those attacks becoming full incidents. We will, of course, link to this in the show notes. Crazy numbers, eh?
That is insane. It seems like the threats only continue to rise, whether it's an institution or the spam texts that you get when someone's trying to impersonate the mail service and say that you owe fees. But of course, we do have security in place to try and prevent these attacks going anywhere.
Yeah, we do. And also the same technology which attackers leverage can also be used defensively. Things like AI can be used to spot threats or really anything that doesn't look right to try and keep our organizations and our data safe.
And we've also discussed things like zero trust on this podcast before.
Have no fear, Sam. It will come up in today's interview. However, my conversation with David Hughes, Senior VP SASE and Security at HPE Networking, covers far more than just zero trust, because even networks themselves can be used as a sensor for security. However, before we get into any of that, I wanted to set the scene a little bit. So the first thing I asked David to tell me was, what does the current threat landscape actually look like in 2026?
So the threat landscape today is getting every year intensified, both in terms of scale and speed and the kind of industrialization.
And it changes quickly, right?
Absolutely. And particularly with the injection of AI and agentic AI, generative AI, change is continuing to accelerate.
And I guess with AI, from an attacker's perspective, it makes everything much easier, maybe more automated.
Well, yeah, there's lots of different ways that attackers can use AI. But when you think about agentic AI, it allows them to be able to automate and move more quickly without having to write automation code. They can be driving these systems with plain English language and be able to operate at scale round the clock. You're able to run 24/7. And if you want to cover more ground, you just start more agents.
Yeah, AI doesn't need to sleep.
No.
Can you just sort of describe some of the more common threats that we have at the moment?
Well, there's all kinds of threats, but obviously there's different kinds of things people are after. They can be after credentials, so trying to steal people's credentials, which is a base for doing something else in future. There's being able to take control, install remote access Trojans so that they can control someone's laptop or computer. There's ransomware where your data is encrypted and then you need to pay to get keys to decrypt that data. There's a whole variety of common schemes.
It's called spear phishing, which is where you're specifically targeting a specific person with specific information about them. But presumably with agentic AI, that could be all automated. You can go and find all that information at scale and you can target them at scale.
Yeah, agentic AI helps collect and correlate information automatically. And then generative AI lets people deepfake audio, deepfake videos, things that they can use in social engineering, which might make it easier for them to do spear phishing type thing or a multi-stage thing where they impersonating someone's boss very effectively and able to get the information they need that way.
And deepfaked audio video has developed so quickly. It's getting more and more impressive and more realistic. And that makes those attacks potentially more viable at scale.
I think that all these things are improving at a dramatic rate. When you look at agentic AI and what it can do on the plus side, it absolutely is revolutionizing the way we think about coding. And so all of these things that can be used by adversaries, you can use yourself as well on the positive side in terms of being able to implement defenses faster and more effectively.
It seems like it's a bit of an arms race.
It's always been an arms race. It's just that new kinds of arms are continually being invented. And I think it's really important for companies, enterprises, organizations to make sure that they are rapidly adopting new defense technology as it becomes available.
So HPE Threat Labs have recently released their inaugural report. What exactly is HPE Threat Labs?
HPE Threat Labs is the organization we have in HPE which researches threats. We run deception networks that collect information about different threats that are out there, as well as we have telemetry that comes from our customers' networks so that we can track what's going on in the environment. The Threat Labs team analyzes all of that, and they are responsible for managing our threat feeds that help us block and mitigate for these threats in real time.
So, David, can you give some of the highlights of the report?
Yeah, I'm not sure you'd say highlights when you're talking about things being compromised, but when you look at the stats, what you'll see is that it's affecting all industries, but in particular, we see a concentration in financial services, in technology, and in governments. The attacks are coming both from nation states as well as organized syndicates that really set up like enterprises. They're very organized and very methodical in terms of how they're going about attacking and monetizing their capabilities.
Are these emerging threats, or have these sort of threats been around for a while, but they're maybe changing?
There's always new techniques, but one of the things with agentic AI and automation is that you're able to use some of the older techniques, but without having to have a human in the loop, you're able to deploy them more broadly and more rapidly.
So how should organizations combat that sort of thing? Or is it something that HPE releases out to customers, so customers don't need to do anything?
So generally, when people deploy, say, our firewall solutions, part of that subscription is a threat feed. And so every day they're getting updates dynamically based on the threats that we're seeing in the field and how they are evolving. There's also things like the Cyber Threat Alliance, where all the leading vendors share cyber threat intelligence. And so the combination of what our research team does, along with what we learn in the industry, along with other open source feeds, those all go into the threat feeds that we distribute to customers. And the customers themselves don't have to do anything. This is all automated.
So how do you go about building security into a network from the start?
Yeah, one of the really important things is that with the escalating threats, you really want to use every single technique that you have. And one of the kind of real latent assets that companies have is their network. The network can be a security sensor and it can be a security enforcement point. So as a sensor, it's monitoring with telemetry from the network. You can monitor the behavior of, say, all of your IoT devices. You may have a door lock that's internet controlled. The telemetry we collect every day, 24/7, tells us how that door lock should operate. Maybe twice a day it calls to a particular DNS server. And so that we can detect when that changes, when there's an anomaly. So if that device is hacked, we see a change in behavior. And so using the network as a sensor is one way that you can augment your security strategy. The second thing is using the network as an enforcement point. So, of course, firewalls can be used as enforcement points, but you can also block traffic earlier near the edge in an access point or in a switch if you have a way of taking global policy defined by a security team and then have that implemented by the network. So a lot of what we're doing at HPE is really at the intersection of networking and security, helping the security teams and the network teams partner with each other and making sure that the network is actually an important piece of the security puzzle.
Network as a sensor from a security perspective is a really interesting concept because, I mean, the door lock example, I guess if you could augment that with other sensors and other information, you could maybe come to some conclusions that as a human looking at that data, you may not be able to come to those conclusions. Is that the sort of thing?
Oh, it's impossible to do as a human because we're collecting billions of data points, and the door lock is just one kind of sensor. So there's hundreds of thousands of types of sensor that we track. And so for every kind of sensor, we are building a baseline of what is normal behavior. And from there, we know what is anomalous behavior. And we don't just have to learn this one customer at a time. It's with fleet learning, so across our entire customer base. And so that's a really important piece of being able to defend against threats which use an IoT device as a hopping point. So coming back to the report, one of the things that we've seen is that in especially the most sophisticated attacks, they're kind of multi-step. It's not just one thing that you do for the bad guys to get what they want. There's usually 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 steps. But often on that chain, in fact, in a majority of cases on that chain somewhere, is an IoT device or a consumer type device. And that means it's really important to be able to track the behavior of those devices to understand if they've been compromised.
Because I suppose an IoT device can sometimes feel a bit like it's not a proper network device. So maybe organizations don't think they properly need to secure it. And actually, what you're saying is sometimes those devices can be good attack vectors.
Those devices, they're basically a complete server inside that IoT device. So it may look like something small or something insignificant, but from the point of view of being a point to leap off from, they're very capable.
You have the ability to be able to write data to it and it's connected to your network, maybe connected into your network, then you could use that as a good jumping off point.
Yes.
I'm guessing what we're talking about here to some extent is zero trust with regards to sort of securing your network and as a way to block entry points into your network. And so that's where zero trust comes in?
Well, yeah, zero trust is all about making sure that users are only able to connect to the applications that they need to be using as part of their organization's policy, and that IoT devices are only able to connect to those resources that they need in order to do the job. So for the example of the door lock, it's connecting back to the manufacturer's website, for instance. Now, what zero trust means when it comes to networking is all about being able to enforce that policy, that global policy, with the network. So rather than having a network where anything can talk to anything, you have a network where each device or each identity can only talk to the resources that identity needs to get its job done. And so this means that when something's compromised, instead of it being able to be a leapfrog kind of point to get to anywhere, it's only going to have a few locations or a few applications or a few servers to which it's authorized to connect.
If your door lock tries to connect onto your file server or a part of the file server it's never accessed before, the network should be like, this isn't right.
There's 2 ways of setting up. Without zero trust, the door lock would be able to access the server. With a fine-grained zero trust policy, that door lock wouldn't even be able to see the server because that's the whole idea of zero trust, least privilege access, and it will not be able to even see the things that it's not allowed to connect to.
But of course, the balance here is that there's the sort of security spectrum, because on one side, you give users and devices access to everything. And from their perspective, everything is completely frictionless. And then the other end of the scale, you give them access to nothing and the network is completely secure. And so I guess zero trust is trying to find that balance of giving really good user experience, but also making sure your network is secure.
I would describe it this way. So in the traditional internet, when it started, it was really an any-to-any network where any server in any university could be used to connect to any server in any other university. This is back in the 1970s and 80s. And then obviously, as it became adopted by enterprise, things like firewalls were invented so that you could have a good inside and a bad outside and block things coming in and out through a single point. But as things have gotten much, much more complicated over the last couple of decades, people have deployed firewalls everywhere doing what we call segmentation. That's kind of the traditional way, any to any, and then cutting back. Zero trust is really starting from the other end of nothing can connect to anything and then adding rules to allow access. So it's kind of a additive rather than subtractive approach. Now, as you pointed out, it can be frustrating for users that want to do something new. There may need to be a policy added for them to be able to do that. But in terms of balancing the experience of the user with the safety of the user, I think people are realizing that in the current environment, it's much more tilted towards better to start with default deny, which is another word for zero trust.
That was a great interview. Thank you so much, David, for your time. I really enjoyed having you on Technology Now. Now, Sam, what did you think of that?
I honestly quite enjoyed the conversation there at the end about zero trust and starting from the opposite end, which is like default deny, to then adding roles. It actually makes me think a little bit about how communications functions. So when you don't want something to leak, for example, then you default deny everyone who doesn't need to be working on it, right? And then slowly over time, you start to bring in more and more people the closer you get to announcing something. That way you can keep track of who is in the know about something so that it doesn't go where it's not supposed to. So the zero trust model actually feels very familiar to me.
We did an episode a few weeks back where we talked about self-driving networks, and it's a really similar conversation. You have to think about your network in a different way. If you start from nobody has access to anything and then add things in, I just want to talk about the threat landscape as it relates to AI and generative AI. You know, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was the fact that we've maybe come from a place where if you wanted to create an attack, you would have to probably write your own piece of code. But we live in the world of vibe coding. You know, you could probably vibe code something like that.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know if you look at the Threat Labs report. It's called In the Wild. I've taken a look through it. And what's interesting to me is like how automated these attack campaigns and deepfakes can become at this stage. So it's almost like the same as like you would try to automate processes within an actual business. And that's how a lot of these cybercrime organizations are functioning now, is more like a Fortune 500 and less like an underground seedy institution. But use of AI for like deep faking or phishing and things like that, that to me is scary. And I feel as though I've heard stories about like now there needs to be like more human level security protocols with people, because you'll have a person who's being impersonated, maybe on the phone calling a lower level person, and that person works in finance and they're being directed to do something that they're actually not supposed to do, but they're getting the pressure of, I'm the CEO or I'm the CFO, I'm telling you, I'm giving permission. But now there need to be more human sort of level protocols where it's like, is there a secret word that only you know and you've spoken verbally? Or how do you prevent the impersonation from threatening your organization? So to me, that's a fascinating conversation.
I've actually had this conversation with family members, and I basically said, if you get a call or even a video call from me and I'm asking for money or something that's suspicious, here's what I want you to do. I'm not going to say on this podcast, but to try and add a human element to it, because you're right, even in the last year, it's become so much more sophisticated. And I think saying I could recognize a deepfaked video, I think that's potentially a risky thing to do, to rely on that.
It starts to introduce more and more of the need for these analog processes, which used to feel quite outdated, in order to protect us from these much more modern attacks, right? So it's funny how it all kind of comes back full circle again.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. Now, Sam, obviously things change incredibly quickly in the world of cybersecurity. However, I did think it was important to leave our interview with a final thought from David about what he thinks people should be doing to stay ahead of the curve when it comes to emerging threats.
There's always been the saying defense in depth or multi-layer defense. People need to be adopting all the technology they can versus putting all their eggs in one basket and thinking that there's one miracle cure. But what I'd say is that for HPE Networking, we are really focused on making sure our customers are able to use their network as part of an overall security solution, making sure that security and networking are thought of together. I think for many customers, they think of them as two separate things, and they may be missing out a lot in terms of being able to use the network as a sensor and use the network as an enforcement point.
That brings us to the end of Technology Now for this week. Thank you to our guest, David Hughes, and of course to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, and if you've enjoyed this episode, please do let us know. Rate and review us wherever you listen to episodes. And if you want to get in contact with us, send us an email to technologynow@hpe.com. And don't forget to subscribe so you can listen first every week. Technology Now is hosted by Sam, Jarrell, and myself, Michael Bird. And this episode was produced by Harry Lampert and Izzy Clark, with production support from Alicia Kempson-Taylor, Becky Bird, Alyssa Mitri, and Janessa Ayosh. Our theme music was composed by Greg Hooper.
Our social editorial team is Rebecca Wissinger, Judy N. Goldman, and Jacqueline Green. And our social media designers are Alejandra Garcia and Ambar Maldonado.
Technology Now is a Fresh Air production for Hewlett Packard Enterprise. And we'll see you at the same time, the same place next week. Cheers.
Bye, y'all.